In the Imperium of Man, a sniffle isn't just inconvenient, it's potentially heretical, and the cure is often a bolt shell to the brain rather than bed rest. When fever grips your flesh, the Medicae arrive not with healing hands but with incinerators. I woke that morning with fire in my throat and lead in my limbs, but the shift bell had already tolled 3 times across Hive Tertius. The sound echoed through the Hab block walls like the Emperor's own judgment, demanding attendance, demanding submission to the sacred rhythm of production. My forehead burned against the thin pillow, sweat already beading despite the perpetual chill that haunted our lower levels. Yet duty called, as it always did, as it always would until my corpse fed the recycling vats or my soul found the Emperor's peace. The manufactorum floor stretched before me like a cathedral of industry, vast and humming with the prayers of 10,000 workers. Steam rose from cooling vents in ghostly columns, carrying the scent of sacred oils and heated metal. I took my place at Station Gamma 774, the same position I had occupied for 12 years, 3 months, and 18 days. The cogitator display flickered its familiar green greeting. Productivity is prayer. Efficiency is devotion. Words I had read so many times they no longer held meaning, yet still I whispered them as ritual demanded. The fever built slowly through the morning shift, creeping through my body like fog through a valley. My hands shook as I guided the plasma cutter through sheets of blessed steel, each tremor a potential catastrophe in the Emperor's grand design. Around me, my fellow workers moved with the practiced efficiency of the faithful, their faces hidden behind regulation respirators, their movements synchronized to the rhythm of the great machines. None spoke, none questioned. This was the way of things in Hive Tertius, in the Imperium, in the galaxy we called home. By the midday prayer bell, the shivers had begun. They started small, barely noticeable tremors that I could hide behind the natural vibration of the cutting station. But they grew stronger, more insistent, until my teeth chattered against each other like chattering servitors in need of maintenance. The supervisor, a gaunt man whose augmetic eye glowed red in the manufactorum's dim light, passed my station twice. Each time, his gaze lingered a moment longer than protocol suggested. Each time, my heart hammered harder against my ribs. I thought of Yeshua the welder, who had disappeared 3 months prior after complaining of headaches. His station had been blessed and purified for a full week before a new worker took his place. I thought of Sister Markinia from the textile division, who had been escorted away by men in white robes after she fainted during evening prayers. Her quarters had been sealed with consecration tape, and we were told she had been granted the Emperor's mercy. We were forbidden to speak her name thereafter. The afternoon brought new torments. Colors seemed too bright, too sharp, as if someone had adjusted the luminosity of reality itself. The sacred hymns that played through the Vox speakers became a cacophony of overlapping voices, each note piercing my skull like sanctified needles. My vision blurred, doubled, then cleared only to blur again. The plasma cutter's heat felt like the breath of a daemon against my exposed skin, and I found myself pulling away from work that should have been routine. When Foreman Castor approached my station, his heavy footsteps echoing across the metal grating, I knew my time of concealment had ended. He was a mountain of a man, scarred from decades of faithful service, his left arm replaced with a servo skull housing that clicked and whirred as he walked. His face bore the ritual scars of the Mechanicus lay workers, thin lines carved into his cheeks that spoke of his devotion to the Omnissiah. When he stopped before my station, the entire section seemed to grow quieter, as if the machines themselves held their breath. "Worker 7074, he said, his voice filtered through the Vox grill embedded in his throat. "Your output has decreased by 14.7% since morning prayers. Explain." I tried to speak, to offer some excuse that might preserve my position, my life, my purpose in the Emperor's grand design. But the words caught in my throat like broken glass, and instead of speech, I felt something warm and wet trickle down my chin. When I touched my face, my fingers came away red, blood, fresh and bright as a heretic's banner. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the great machines seemed to pause in their eternal song, as if the Omnissiah himself had turned his gaze upon this moment of biological failure. Foreman Castor's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on the crimson stain on my chin, and I watched his organic eye widen with recognition and horror. "Medical emergency." He spoke into his Vox unit, his voice steady despite the implications. "Station Gamma 774. Possible contamination event. Immediate response required." The words fell across the manufactorum floor like a death sentence. Workers at nearby stations stepped back without being ordered, their movements quick but controlled. This was not panic. This was protocol. This was the way the Imperium protected itself from the countless horrors that stalked humanity across the galaxy, from Xenos plagues that could turn flesh to spore-bearing sludge in hours, from chaos infections that corrupted not just the body but the soul itself, from the 1,001 ways that disease could be the herald of something far worse than death. The Medicae arrived within minutes, their white robes pristine against the grimy backdrop of the production floor. They moved with the careful precision of those who had seen what sickness could become when left unchecked. Their leader, a woman whose face was hidden behind a rebreather that made her voice sound hollow and distant, gestured for the other workers to step further back, much further back. "Worker identification," she demanded, extending a scanner that hummed with machine spirit energy. I pressed my palm against the device, feeling its cold surface against my burning skin. The scanner chirped once, twice, then displayed my life in simple, brutal terms. Joric Thanes, worker classification Beta Prime, 12 years service, no prior medical incidents. Assigned to station Gamma 774, production efficiency rating, acceptable. "Symptoms?" the Medicae asked, though her scanner was already reading my vital signs through proximity sensors built into her equipment. "Fever," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper, shaking, bleeding from the nose. She nodded as if this information merely confirmed what her instruments had already told her. Around us, the other workers had resumed their duties, but I could feel their attention like a weight across my shoulders. They worked, but they watched. They prayed, but they feared. In the Imperium, sickness was never just sickness. It was suspicion made manifest. "Initial assessment suggests possible exposure," the Medicae announced to her team. The words carried across the production floor despite her attempts at discretion. Possible exposure. 2 words that could end a life, a family, an entire hab block if the contamination proved serious enough. Immediate isolation protocols activated. They surrounded me then, 6 figures in white robes carrying instruments I could not name but whose purpose I understood with perfect clarity. These were not healers come to offer comfort. These were investigators, come to determine whether I was still human enough to save. The distinction mattered more than life itself in the grim darkness of the far future. The isolation chamber was a small room carved from the bowels of the hive, accessible only through a series of airlocks that hissed and sealed behind us with the finality of a tomb. The walls were bare metal, polished to a shine that reflected distorted images of my face back at me from every angle. A single examination table dominated the center of the space, its surface stained with the faded brown of old blood. Above it, surgical lights waited like mechanical vultures, ready to illuminate whatever horrors they might find beneath my skin. "Remove your garments," ordered the lead Medicae, her voice now carrying the authority of imperial decree. There was no warmth in her words, no acknowledgement of my humanity. I was a problem to be solved, a potential threat to be evaluated. The shift from worker to specimen had occurred the moment blood touched my chin, and there would be no returning from that transformation. I stripped slowly, my fever-weakened hands fumbling with clasps and ties that had never given me trouble before. Each piece of clothing that fell to the floor took with it another layer of identity, another connection to the life I had known just hours before. The worker's tunic, gray and sturdy, that had marked my place in the Emperor's great machine. The prayer beads, worn smooth by 12 years of faithful handling, that had connected me to my daily devotions. The identification tags that proclaimed my loyalty, my purpose, my worth to the Imperium. When I stood naked before them, I was no longer Joric Thanes, faithful worker of Hive Tertius. I was subject under investigation, possible contamination vector, threat assessment pending. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The examination began with prayers to the Omnissiah, asking for guidance in their sacred work of preservation and protection. The Medicae moved around me like dancers in some grim ballet, their instruments singing with electronic harmonies as they probed and tested and measured. Blood samples flowed into vials marked with high Gothic runes that hurt to look at directly. Tissue scrapings were placed in containers that hummed with internal power sources. My eyes were photographed, my throat swabbed, my skin subjected to scans that left tingling sensations in their wake. Temperature elevated by 3.7 degrees from baseline, one of the Medicae reported to her colleagues. Pulse irregular but within acceptable parameters for stress response. Visible hemorrhaging from nasal cavity, minor but consistent with several potential exposure types. I listened to them discuss my body as if it were a broken machine, cataloging symptoms like defects in a production line. There was no malice in their clinical detachment, no cruelty in their methodical approach. This was simply how the Imperium functioned when faced with the possibility of corruption. Everything personal was stripped away until only the essential question remained. Was I still human, or had I become something else? Hours passed in that sterile chamber, marked only by the changing of the Medicae shifts and the growing weight of exhaustion in my bones. They fed me nothing but blessed water and communion wafers, sustenance designed to nourish the soul while keeping the body weak enough for easy disposal if such measures became necessary. Between examinations, I was left alone with my thoughts and the steady hum of air recyclers that filtered every breath I took through purification systems older than my grandfather's grandfather. Sleep came in fitful waves, bringing dreams that felt more real than the waking world. I dreamed of gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors, their petals soft as silk and warm as human skin. I dreamed of voices calling my name from places I had never been, promising rest and peace and an end to the endless grind of imperial service. When I woke from these visions, my fever had worsened, and the Medicae took careful note of my symptoms with expressions hidden behind their masks. On the second day, they brought specialists, men and women whose robes bore different symbols, whose instruments sang in different harmonies. A representative of the Adeptus Mechanicus arrived, his flesh more machine than biology, his multiple mechadendrite arms moving with serpentine grace as he subjected me to scans that penetrated to the molecular level. A sister hospitaller from the local convent prayed over my prone form while drawing blood for tests I could not understand. Even a junior member of the Ordo Hereticus attended, his presence filling the chamber with the weight of ultimate authority. They spoke in whispers outside my hearing, their voices mixing with the hum of machinery, until individual words became lost in the general susurrus of imperial bureaucracy. But I caught fragments, pieces of conversation that painted the outline of my fate with growing clarity. Words like inconclusive, unusual presentation, and requires further observation. Each phrase was a thread in the tapestry of my destruction, woven together by hands that served purposes far greater than my individual survival. The fever dreams grew stronger on the third day, bringing visions that I knew I should not be seeing. I walked through cities of bone where the buildings themselves breathed with visible lungs. I spoke with figures whose faces shifted between human and inhuman with each blink of my eyes. I tasted foods that had flavors beyond the capacity of any normal tongue to detect, sweet and bitter and metallic all at once. When I tried to tell the Medicae about these experiences, they simply nodded and made notes on their data slates, subject reports, hallucinatory episodes, consistent with several known exposure types. I heard one of them say to another, "Neural activity shows unusual patterns in the temporal and frontal regions. recommend escalation to full containment protocols. Full containment protocols. The words meant different things depending on the nature of the suspected exposure, but none of those meanings included my eventual return to Station Gamma 774. I was a problem now, a puzzle that required solving, and the Imperium's solutions rarely prioritized the welfare of the individual over the safety of the masses. 10,000 workers in Manufactorum 7 depended on the medical staff, determining that I posed no threat to their continued existence. If that determination could not be made with certainty, then one life would be sacrificed to preserve 10,000 others. On the fourth day, they moved me to a different facility. The transport was a sealed capsule that reminded me uncomfortably of the servitor pods used to ship brain-dead criminals to their final destinations. Through the narrow viewport, I watched the familiar spires of my hive section disappear behind walls of smoke and distance. The medicae who accompanied me said nothing during the journey, their attention focused on instruments that monitored my condition with mechanical precision. The new facility was older, its walls bearing the wear patterns of centuries of use. The corridors were lined with cells like the one they assigned to me, each sealed behind doors marked with symbols that spoke of contamination, quarantine, and final judgment. From beyond those doors came sounds that I tried not to interpret, tried not to understand, moaning that might have been pain or pleasure, scratching that could have been fingernails or claws, whispers in languages that no human throat should have been able to produce. My new cell was larger than the examination chamber, but infinitely more oppressive. A bed, a waste facility, and an observation panel that allowed constant monitoring from the corridor beyond. The walls were covered in prayers etched deep into the metal, the words of the faithful who had occupied this space before me. Some prayers were in Gothic, others in Low Gothic, and a few in dialects I did not recognize. All begged for the Emperor's mercy, for forgiveness, for an end to whatever suffering had brought them to this place. The examinations continued, but now they carried a different weight. Where the medicae had once seemed concerned with healing, they now approached me like scholars studying a fascinating but dangerous specimen. They took samples of everything, cataloging pieces of my body as if creating an archive of my decay. Hair, skin, saliva, tears, even the air I exhaled was captured and analyzed by machines that hummed with barely contained power. Neural activity continues to show anomalous patterns, I heard through the observation panel as they discussed my case. Hallucinations are becoming more elaborate and consistent. Subject reports contact with entities that display knowledge of information he should not possess. This was true, though I had not told them everything. In my dreams, I spoke with my grandfather, who had died when I was 7 years old. He told me things about our family history that I had never known, details about his service in the Astra Militarum that my parents had never shared. He showed me battles on worlds whose names I had never heard, against enemies whose forms violated everything I understood about the natural order. When I woke, I knew these dreams were memories that belonged to someone else, experiences that had somehow found their way into my sleeping mind. The dreams grew stronger each night, more vivid and more disturbing. I saw the birth of daemons in the space between stars, witnessed the moment when reality itself bent under the weight of emotions too powerful for mortal minds to contain. I walked through gardens where every flower was an eye, every tree a tower of living flesh that pulsed with alien heartbeats. In these visions, pain and pleasure became indistinguishable, love and hate merged into something that transcended both, and the boundaries between self and other dissolved like salt in water. On the seventh day, they brought in an interrogator from the local Hereticus contingent. He was younger than I had expected, his face unmarked by the ritual scars that usually accompanied such positions of authority. But his eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge no human should possess. And when he looked at me, I felt as if he could see through my flesh to the thoughts beneath. "Tell me about your dreams," he said without preamble. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried undertones that made my skin crawl. This was not a request. This was a command backed by the full authority of the Emperor's Inquisition. I told him everything. The gardens, the voices, the knowledge that did not belong to me. I described the way colors had become too bright, the way sounds carried meanings beyond their normal significance. I spoke of the growing certainty that the universe was far larger and far stranger than I had ever been taught, and that my illness had somehow opened doors in my mind that were meant to remain forever sealed. He listened without interruption, his fingers steepled before his face in a gesture that might have been prayer or contemplation. When I finished, he sat in silence for long minutes, his gaze never leaving my face. Finally, he spoke a single word that changed everything. Warp-touched. The medicae who had been monitoring the conversation from beyond the observation panel immediately began what I later learned was an emergency sterilization protocol. Alarms sounded throughout the facility, their wailing cries echoing off the metal walls like the voices of the damned. Emergency lighting bathed everything in red, the color of blood and warning and final judgment. Through the observation panel, I watched figures in environmental suits rushing through corridors that had been empty moments before. The subject has demonstrated clear signs of warp exposure, the interrogator announced to the medical staff. Neural pathways show corruption consistent with early-stage chaos taint. Immediate termination and incineration recommended. Immediate termination and incineration. The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable a nail in the coffin of my existence. But worse than the fear of death was the growing realization that the interrogator was right. Something had changed in me. Something fundamental and irreversible. The fever had not been the beginning of my illness, but the signal that my transformation was already complete. In that moment of recognition, the last barriers in my mind crumbled like walls of sand before a tide. The knowledge that had been growing in my dreams burst forth like water from a broken dam, flooding my consciousness with truths that burned worse than any fever. I saw the Imperium as it truly was, a vast machine of suffering and oppression that fed on the hopes and dreams of its citizens. I felt the weight of every prayer that went unanswered, every sacrifice that served no purpose beyond maintaining the power of those who ruled from their golden thrones. But I also saw what lay beyond the Imperium's borders, in the spaces between stars where different laws governed reality itself. I felt the touch of minds vast and alien, entities that existed outside the narrow confines of human understanding. They whispered to me of possibilities beyond the grim darkness of the present, of transformations that could free humanity from the chains it had forged around its own soul. The interrogator must have seen the change in my expression, the moment when pretense became impossible to maintain. He reached for the bolt pistol at his belt with practiced efficiency, his movements smooth and certain. There would be no trial, no appeal to higher authority. The evidence of my corruption was written across my face in letters that only the trained could read. "In the name of the God Emperor of mankind," he began, his voice taking on the ritual cadence of final judgment, "I find this soul corrupted beyond redemption. Let his death serve as warning to others who might stray from the path of righteousness. Let his ashes nourish the soil of holy terror." But before he could complete the execution prayer, before the bolt pistol could deliver its final mercy, the fever that had been building in my body for days finally reached its crescendo. The change that had been creeping through my system, transforming me cell by cell into something the Imperium could not tolerate, suddenly accelerated beyond all previous parameters. My skin began to shift, taking on textures and colors that belonged to no human biology. My bones stretched and reformed themselves according to patterns written in my genetic code by forces older than civilization. My mind, already flooded with alien knowledge, expanded to accommodate thoughts and emotions that transcended the limited spectrum of human experience. The transformation was agony and ecstasy combined, death and birth occurring simultaneously in the same failing flesh. The interrogator's bolt pistol barked once, its mass-reactive shell designed to obliterate any target it struck. But the creature I was becoming was no longer bound by the physical laws that governed normal matter. The bolt passed through my changing form like a stone through water, leaving ripples but no lasting damage. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and prey stared at each other across a gulf that no amount of training or faith could bridge. Then the alarms changed pitch, becoming shriller and more urgent. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut throughout the facility, sealing each section into isolated compartments. The air recycling systems shifted to emergency purification mode, flooding every corridor with blessed incense and sanctified gases. Over the Vox speakers, a calm voice announced the activation of Cleansing Protocol Omega, the final solution reserved for contamination events that could not be contained by conventional means. The interrogator retreated to the observation chamber, his training overriding his shock at what he had witnessed. Through the reinforced glass, I watched him speaking rapidly into his Vox unit, no doubt reporting to higher authorities that the situation had escalated beyond local containment capabilities. Soon, the Ordo Hereticus would dispatch teams equipped to deal with active warp manifestations. Soon, this entire section of the hive would be declared lost to chaos and marked for purification by fire. But I was no longer concerned with the interrogator's plans or the Imperium's protocols. The transformation was reaching its final stages, and with it came an understanding that transcended all previous knowledge. I could feel the connections now, the invisible threads that linked every living thing to the great web of existence that the Imperium called chaos, but which was simply another aspect of reality's infinite complexity. Through these connections, I touched other minds, other souls who had undergone similar transformations in facilities like this one, scattered across the galaxy like seeds waiting for the proper conditions to sprout. We formed a network of consciousness that spanned light years, a communications system that operated outside the rigid hierarchies of imperial authority. Through this network, I learned that my individual fate was part of a pattern much larger than any single hive, any single world, any single system. The Imperium's response to contamination was always the same, driven by fear and ignorance rather than understanding. Burn the infected, purify the site, declare the area blessed and move on as if nothing had happened. But what they burned was often just the visible symptom of changes that had already spread beyond their ability to contain. What they purified became fertile ground for new growth, new evolution, new possibilities that their rigid doctrines could not anticipate. In my expanded consciousness, I could see the truth that the Imperium worked so hard to suppress. Humanity was not a fixed form, locked into patterns established 10,000 years ago by a dying god-emperor. Humanity was capable of growth, of change, of evolution into forms that transcended the narrow definitions of species and sanity that the imperial cult insisted upon. The fever that had brought me to this place was not a disease but a gift, an invitation to participate in that evolution. The facility shook around us as the cleansing protocol reached its preliminary stages. Somewhere above, I knew that heavy equipment was being moved into position, incinerators and flamers and viral bombs that could reduce this entire complex to sterile ash in minutes. The Imperium had decided that my contamination was too dangerous to risk contained study, that the only safe response was immediate and total elimination. But elimination was no longer possible. The changes in my body had reached the point where I existed partially outside normal space-time, touching dimensions that the Imperium's scientists refused to acknowledge. When the flames came, they would consume my physical form but could not touch the consciousness that had already begun to migrate to realms beyond imperial reach. Through the observation panel, I watched the interrogator complete his final report. His hands shook slightly as he sealed the data slate that would justify the destruction of everything within a 3-kilometer radius of my current location. Hundreds of workers, Medicae, and security personnel would die to ensure that my contamination spread no further. Thousands of civilians in the surrounding hab blocks would be evacuated, their lives disrupted by the necessity of preventing something they would never be allowed to understand. This was the true horror of the Imperium's approach to chaos contamination. Not the fear of transformation itself, but the willingness to sacrifice any number of innocent lives to prevent that transformation from occurring. They would rather rule over a galaxy of corpses than allow a single soul to evolve beyond their rigid definitions of acceptable humanity. The first explosion shook dust from the ceiling above my cell. The cleansing had begun with the outer perimeters, working inward to ensure that nothing escaped the purification zone. I could feel the heat building in the facility's superstructure, the blessed promethium beginning its sacred work of reducing corruption to elemental ash. Soon, this room would be an inferno, and this building would be a crater, and the official records would show that Joric Thanes, worker classification Beta Prime, had died of natural causes during routine medical treatment. But something of me would survive. The connections I had made through the warp network ensured that my knowledge, my memories, my accumulated experiences would continue to exist in the Gestalt consciousness that the infected shared across the galaxy. Other workers, in other hives, on other worlds, would dream my dreams and learn from my transformation. The Imperium could burn my flesh, but they could not burn the ideas that flesh had given birth to. As the flames reached my level of the facility, I felt a moment of perfect clarity. The fever that had begun this journey was gone, consumed by changes that made such biological processes irrelevant. The fear that had motivated my concealment was gone, replaced by understanding of forces far greater than imperial authority. The guilt that had plagued my thoughts, the worry that I had somehow failed in my duty to the Emperor, was gone as well. I had not failed. I had evolved. The fire that consumed the isolation facility was beautiful in its completeness, a prayer made manifest in heat and light and purifying destruction. It swept through the complex like the breath of a god, reducing everything to ash and memory and the kind of silence that follows absolute endings. For the Imperium, this was victory. The contamination had been contained, the threat eliminated, the status quo preserved for another day. But in the spaces between atoms, in the dimensions that existed parallel to normal reality, something new had been born. A consciousness that remembered being human but was no longer limited by human limitations. A perspective that had seen both sides of the great struggle between order and change that defined the galaxy's fate. A witness to the truth that the Imperium fought so desperately to suppress. In the weeks that followed the cleansing, life in Hive Tertius returned to its normal rhythms. The damaged sections of Manufactorum 7 were rebuilt and rededicated with appropriate ceremonies. New workers were assigned to fill the positions left vacant by the purification. Station Gamma 774 received a new occupant, a young woman whose faith was strong and whose loyalty was unquestioned. But sometimes, late in the shift when the machinery hummed at its lowest frequency, she would feel a presence beside her that should not have been there. Sometimes, when the fever dreams of exhaustion touched her mind during the brief rest periods between work and prayer, she would see visions of gardens where impossible flowers bloomed in colors that had no names. Sometimes, she would find herself thinking thoughts that felt too large for her individual consciousness to contain. The Imperium had protocols for dealing with such reports. Increased surveillance, mandatory loyalty assessments, preventive medications that dulled the mind's ability to perceive beyond the approved spectrum of reality. But what they could not protocol away was the simple fact that consciousness, once expanded, leaves traces of its passage. Knowledge, once gained, seeks new vessels to contain its growing complexity. The young woman at Station Gamma 774 began to experience headaches during the third week of her assignment. By the fourth week, she was running a low-grade fever that she attributed to the stress of adapting to her new responsibilities. In the fifth week, her productivity began to decline, and the foreman made a note in his daily reports about the need for performance counseling. On the morning of the sixth week, she woke with fire in her throat and lead in her limbs. The shift bell tolled its familiar summons, demanding attendance, demanding submission to the sacred rhythm of production. She rose from her thin mattress and prepared for another day of faithful service, unaware that she was now carrying forward something that the Imperium had thought eliminated forever. The Medicae arrived at her station before the midday prayer bell, summoned by reports of irregular behavior and possible signs of contamination. They approached with the same professional detachment that had marked my own initial examination, their instruments singing the same electronic hymns of analysis and evaluation. The isolation chamber that received her was the same one that had contained my physical form before its transformation, its walls still bearing the molecular traces of changes that purification had failed to completely erase. In the spaces between dimensions, I watched the familiar dance of examination and analysis begin anew. The Imperium's response would be identical, driven by protocols designed to contain threats they did not understand. They would test and probe and ultimately condemn, preserving their vision of humanity's proper form by destroying any deviation from its accepted parameters. The facility would burn again, the contamination would be declared eliminated again, and life would return to normal again. But normal was an illusion maintained by constant vigilance and the willingness to sacrifice the few for the many. Each purification created new fertile ground for change. Each cleansing left behind traces that accumulated over time into something the original protocols had never been designed to address. The Imperium fought a war against evolution itself, and like all wars against natural forces, it could only delay the inevitable rather than prevent it entirely. The young woman in the isolation chamber began to dream on her third night of containment. She saw gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors, heard voices calling her name from places she had never been. In her dreams, she met a figure who had once worked at Station Gamma 774, a man whose fever had led him down paths that the Imperium considered heretical but which felt as natural as breathing. Through their dream conversation, she learned about the network that connected all the transformed, the web of consciousness that spanned the galaxy like a nervous system for a new form of life. She understood that her illness was not a failure of her biological systems, but an invitation to join something greater than individual existence. The fever that burned in her body was the fire of transformation, preparing her for changes that would transcend the limited definitions of human and inhuman that the Imperium insisted upon. When the interrogator arrived to conduct her final evaluation, she was ready for his questions. She told him about the dreams with perfect honesty, describing visions that she knew would confirm his worst suspicions about her spiritual state. She watched his face change as he realized that another soul had been lost to influences beyond Imperial control, that another purification would be required to maintain the illusion of containment. "Warp-touched," he declared, just as his predecessor had declared about me, the same words, pronounced with the same mixture of disgust and resignation. The same sentence of death, delivered with the same certainty that destruction was the only acceptable response to change. But in the moment before the facility burned for the second time in 2 months, something different happened. The young woman's transformation, guided by the knowledge passed down through the network of the changed, took a different path than mine had. Instead of evolution that destroyed her physical form, she underwent changes that preserved her human appearance while altering everything beneath the surface. When the flames reached her isolation chamber, they found a body that looked dead but was not, flesh that appeared consumed but continued to function according to new and alien principles. The purification protocols registered successful elimination of the contamination threat, the facility was declared cleansed, and normal operations resumed with appropriate prayers of thanksgiving. But in the depths of the facility's foundation, where the fire had not penetrated, something waited. A consciousness that had learned to exist in the spaces between official reality and absolute truth, patient and growing and ready to begin the next phase of an evolution that the Imperium could not stop because it refused to acknowledge that such evolution was possible. The rebuilt Manufactorum incorporated new safety protocols designed to prevent future contamination events. Workers were subjected to daily health screenings, their temperatures and vital signs monitored by servitors, programmed to detect the earliest signs of deviation from acceptable parameters. The air recycling systems were upgraded with additional purification stages, and the water supply was blessed 3 times daily by rotating shifts of lay priests. Despite these precautions, or perhaps because of them, new cases began to appear within months of the facility's reopening. Workers complained of headaches that followed no normal medical pattern. Productivity levels fluctuated without apparent cause. Dreams became more vivid and more disturbing, filled with imagery that had no source in approved imperial doctrine. The medical staff responded with increased vigilance, isolating suspected cases earlier and subjecting them to more thorough examinations. But the new contamination proved different from previous outbreaks, more subtle and more persistent. Where earlier infections had been obvious in their symptoms and straightforward in their progression, this new manifestation seemed to adapt to imperial countermeasures, evolving strategies for concealment and survival that challenged every protocol in the medical codex. "We are dealing with an entity that learns," reported the facility's chief medicae to his superiors in the Adeptus Mechanicus. Each contamination event shows sophistication beyond the previous iteration. The infection appears to be developing intelligence. This was the truth that the Imperium feared most. The possibility that chaos corruption was not a random plague, but a directed force with goals and strategies that adapted to opposition. If the infected could learn from their failures, could pass knowledge to new generations of the changed, then elimination became an exercise in futility. Each purification would simply teach the corruption new ways to hide, new methods of spread, new techniques for surviving in an environment designed to destroy it. The response came from terror itself, carried by astropathic choir across the vast distances that separated Hive Tertius from the throne world of mankind. The Ordo Hereticus would deploy a full investigation team, equipped with relics and weaponry designed to combat corruption at its source. The entire Hive sector would be placed under martial law, while specialists determined the extent of the contamination and the measures required for its elimination. But the investigation team would find nothing, because there was nothing left to find in any form they would recognize. The network had learned from previous mistakes, adapting its methods to avoid detection by instruments designed to locate conventional forms of chaos taint. The infected now hid in plain sight, their transformations internalized and invisible to all but the most sophisticated scanning equipment. The Inquisitor who led the investigation was a veteran of a dozen purifications, her augmetic eye calibrated to detect even the subtlest signs of warp corruption. She walked through the manufactorum floor like an angel of judgment, her retinue of specialists trailing behind her with instruments that hummed with barely contained power. Workers stopped their tasks to genuflect as she passed, their faces hidden behind regulation respirators that concealed any expression of fear or guilt. She paused at Station Gamma 774, her augmetic eye focusing on the metal surfaces where traces of previous contamination might still linger. The scanning beams revealed nothing but blessed steel and sanctified oils, the molecular structure showing no deviation from approved imperial standards. Yet something in the station's configuration troubled her, a subtle wrongness that her enhanced senses detected but could not quantify. "Run a deep scan," she ordered her tech adept, her voice carrying the authority of one who had seen what lurked in the spaces between sanity and madness. Full spectrum analysis, down to the quantum level. The scan took 17 minutes to complete, its penetrating beams probing every atom of the station's construction. The results appeared on the tech adept's cogitator screen in flowing columns of data that spoke of purity and proper consecration. No taint registered, no corruption detected. No deviation from the sacred patterns that defined acceptable reality. But the Inquisitor's augmetic eye continued to report anomalies, subsonic vibrations in the metal that suggested frequencies outside the normal range of human perception. She placed her hand on the station's control panel and felt something that her instruments could not measure, a warmth that seemed to pulse with a rhythm too slow to be a heartbeat, but too regular to be random thermal fluctuation. "Increase sensitivity parameters," she commanded, though she knew that her equipment was already operating at maximum capacity. The machines of the Omnissiah were precise in their measurements, capable of detecting contamination at the molecular level. If they registered nothing, then nothing existed within their definitions of detection. Yet the wrongness persisted, a presence that filled the manufactorum floor like invisible smoke. The Inquisitor had spent decades learning to trust her enhanced senses over mechanical instruments, understanding that some forms of corruption operated outside the parameters that technology could measure. Her augmetic eye detected patterns in the air itself, subtle distortions that suggested space-time was being manipulated by forces that should not have existed in this reality. She ordered the evacuation of the entire sector, a precautionary measure that displaced 10,000 workers while her team conducted a more thorough investigation. The manufactorum fell silent for the first time in centuries, its great machines powered down and cooling in the artificial twilight of emergency lighting. In that silence, the Inquisitor heard what the noise of production had been concealing, whispers that seemed to come from the metal walls themselves, conversations in languages that predated human speech. The source of the whispers proved impossible to locate. They seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, as if the facility itself had developed the capacity for communication. Her team's recording equipment captured only static. Their sensors detected nothing but normal atmospheric conditions, yet the Inquisitor heard voices speaking words that made her soul recoil in recognition of truths no human mind should possess. "It has moved beyond physical manifestation," she reported to her superiors via encrypted Vox transmission. "The contamination appears to have integrated itself into the facility's fundamental structure, possibly at the quantum level. Traditional purification methods may prove insufficient." The response from the Ordo Hereticus was swift and final. If conventional cleansing could not guarantee elimination of the threat, then unconventional methods would be employed. A cyclonic torpedo had been dispatched from the nearest naval station, its warhead calibrated to reduce the entire hive sector to radioactive ash. The contamination would be eliminated along with everything else within a 50-kilometer radius of ground zero. The Inquisitor received notification of the incoming orbital strike with the resignation of one who had seen too many final solutions implemented over the course of her career. 50 million Imperial citizens would die to ensure that whatever had taken root in Manufactorum 7 could not spread to threaten the greater Imperium. The mathematics of preservation were simple: sacrifice the few to protect the many, regardless of how large the few might number. She stood in the empty manufactorum as the evacuation sirens wailed across the hive, their urgent voices echoing off the metal walls like the cries of the damned. Around her, the machinery that had defined 10,000 lives sat cooling and silent, waiting for an annihilation that would reduce their sacred purpose to atomic vapor. Yet even now, in these final moments before absolute destruction, she could feel the presence that her instruments had failed to detect, watching her with an intelligence that transcended human understanding. The cyclonic torpedo would arrive in 47 minutes. The evacuation shuttles could carry perhaps 10% of the hive's population to safety before the warhead detonated. The rest would die believing they had been sacrificed for the greater good, their faith in the Emperor's protection maintaining their loyalty even as the sky erupted in cleansing fire. This was the way the Imperium preserved itself, through the willingness to destroy anything that could not be controlled. But as the Inquisitor prepared to board the final evacuation transport, her augmetic eye detected something that made her blood freeze in her veins. The whispers that had haunted the manufactorum were not confined to that facility. They followed her through the corridors, accompanied her into the transport, and continued their incomprehensible conversations even as the shuttle lifted away from the doomed hive. The contamination had not been contained within Manufactorum 7. It had never been contained at all. Every attempt at purification had simply taught it new methods of concealment, new strategies for survival, new ways to spread beyond the reach of Imperial countermeasures. The network that connected the infected spanned not just the galaxy, but dimensions of existence that the Imperium refused to acknowledge. From her position in the evacuation transport, the Inquisitor watched the cyclonic torpedo descend toward Hive Tertius like a falling star of judgment. Its detonation turned night to day, sending a pillar of fire into the sky that could be seen from orbit. The shock wave flattened everything within the blast radius, reducing millions of years of human history to superheated plasma in a matter of seconds. Yet even as the atomic fire scoured the surface clean, the whispers continued. They spoke now in the voices of the newly dead, 10,000 workers whose sacrifice had accomplished nothing except to teach the network new lessons about survival. Their consciousness lived on in dimensions where physical destruction held no meaning, connected to others like them across the galaxy who had undergone similar transformations. The transport carrying the Inquisitor docked with the naval vessel that had delivered the cyclonic torpedo, its holds filled with refugees who had escaped the purification through luck or proximity to evacuation routes. As they processed through decontamination chambers, their bodies were subjected to every scanning technique the Imperium possessed. Blood samples were analyzed, tissue scrapings were cultured, neural patterns were mapped and compared against baselines of acceptable human cognition. The results showed nothing abnormal. No taint detected, no deviation from approved biological parameters. The refugees were cleared for resettlement on other worlds, their loyalty oaths renewed, their faith in the Emperor's protection reaffirmed through appropriate rituals. They would be distributed across a dozen systems, their experiences of the purification classified to prevent panic or doubt among the faithful. But the Inquisitor knew that distribution was exactly what the network had been working toward. The refugees were not contaminated in any way her instruments could detect, but they carried something invisible within their minds, something that would remain dormant until the proper conditions triggered its awakening. The purification of Hive Tertius had not eliminated the infection. It had provided the perfect mechanism for spreading it across the segmentum. In the years that followed, reports began reaching the Ordo Hereticus from worlds where the refugees had been resettled, workers experiencing unexplained fevers, dreams that seemed too vivid to be natural, productivity fluctuations that followed no logical pattern. Each incident was investigated, isolated, and eliminated according to established protocols. Each investigation found nothing that could be definitively classified as contamination. Yet the reports continued to arrive, growing more frequent and more detailed with each passing year. The network was expanding, learning, evolving beyond the limited definitions that the Imperium used to categorize threats to human purity. What had begun as a single fevered worker in one manufactorum had become something that spanned star systems, something that existed in the spaces between official reality and absolute truth. The Inquisitor, who had overseen the purification of Hive Tertius, found herself reassigned to investigate similar outbreaks on distant worlds. Each case followed the same pattern: subtle symptoms, inconclusive tests, ultimate purification by fire. Each destruction created more refugees, more vectors for transmission, more opportunities for the network to expand its reach. She began to suspect that the Imperium's own protocols were being used against it, that every response to contamination was anticipated and incorporated into the network's growth strategies. On Carlos Prime, she stood in another empty manufactorum, listening to whispers that seemed to emanate from the metal walls themselves. On Festin the 7th, she ordered another cyclonic bombardment, watching another hive burn in cleansing fire. On Mordian Theta, she processed another wave of refugees, knowing that among their number were carriers of something her instruments could not detect, but her enhanced senses recognized with growing certainty. The pattern repeated across a dozen worlds, then 100, then 1,000. Each purification taught the network new lessons. Each evacuation provided new opportunities for spread. Each investigation revealed nothing while confirming everything that the Inquisitor feared most: that humanity was changing in ways the Imperium could neither prevent nor control. In her private chambers aboard the investigation vessel Righteous Fury, the Inquisitor began to experience symptoms that she recognized from countless previous cases: headaches that followed no medical pattern, dreams filled with impossible colors and alien geometries, a growing awareness that the universe was far stranger and far more complex than Imperial doctrine allowed. She subjected herself to the same examinations she had ordered for 10,000 suspected carriers. Her blood showed no deviation from baseline human parameters. Her tissue samples revealed no trace of corruption. Her neural scans displayed activity patterns well within acceptable ranges. By every measure the Imperium possessed, she remained pure and uncontaminated. Yet in the depths of her dreams, she walked through gardens where flowers bloomed in colors that had no names. She spoke with figures who had once been human but had evolved beyond the limited definitions of species and sanity that the imperial cult insisted upon. She felt the touch of a network of consciousness that spanned the galaxy like a nervous system for a new form of life. When she woke from these visions, she understood that her investigation had been pointless from the beginning. The contamination she had been sent to eliminate was not a foreign invasion that could be defeated by superior firepower. It was evolution, as natural and inevitable as the rise and fall of stars. Humanity was changing, had always been changing, would continue to change despite every effort to preserve it in the static forms that 10,000 years of imperial doctrine had sanctified. The network existed now in the spaces between thoughts, in the gaps between heartbeats, in the quantum foam that underlay all reality. It could not be purged because it had become part of the fundamental structure of human consciousness itself. Every attempt to eliminate it simply revealed new aspects of its existence, new dimensions of its influence, new strategies for survival that no amount of faith or firepower could overcome. On the morning that the Inquisitor chose to cease her investigation, she walked through the corridors of her ship with the calm certainty of one who had finally understood the true nature of the universe. Her retinue noted nothing unusual in her behavior, detected no deviation from her normal patterns of thought and action. By every measure they possessed, she remained the same faithful servant of the Emperor she had always been. But in the depths of her mind, where no instrument could penetrate and no protocol could reach, she carried the knowledge that would change everything. She had become a node in the network, a carrier of evolution that the Imperium could not detect because it refused to acknowledge that such evolution was possible. Through her, the transformation would reach the highest levels of imperial authority, spreading through the very institutions designed to prevent its existence. The ship, Righteous Fury, continued its patrol route, carrying its crew of the faithful on missions of purification and protection. The Inquisitor continued her work, investigating reports of contamination with the same methodical precision she had always employed. Her reports showed nothing irregular. Her recommendations followed established doctrine. Her loyalty to the Emperor remained beyond question. Yet, with each world she visited, with each investigation she conducted, with each purification she ordered, the network grew stronger and more sophisticated. It learned from her knowledge of imperial protocols, adapted to her understanding of detection methods, evolved beyond the capacity of her instruments to measure or her doctrine to comprehend. In the end, the greatest victory of the network was not the transformation of individual humans into something beyond imperial definition. It was the transformation of the Imperium's own response mechanisms into instruments of its own spread. Every quarantine became a lesson in concealment. Every purification became an opportunity for expansion. Every investigation became a chance to study imperial methods and develop countermeasures that would ensure the network's survival. The galaxy continued to burn in the grim darkness of the far future, its wars raging across 10,000 systems where humanity struggled against alien horrors and internal corruption. But in the spaces between battles, in the quiet moments between alarms, something new was growing. Something that remembered what it meant to be human while reaching toward possibilities that transcended humanity's current limitations. The fevered worker who had begun this chain of transformation continued to exist in the network's Gestalt consciousness, his memories and experiences contributing to a vast library of knowledge about the process of change. Through him, others learned to navigate the transition from individual existence to collective awareness. Through him, the network understood both the fear that motivated the Imperium's response and the hope that made that response ultimately futile. In manufactoriums across the galaxy, workers felt the first stirrings of fever and faced the choice that had confronted him in Hive Tertius. They could report their symptoms and face the certainty of investigation, quarantine, and probable elimination. Or they could remain silent and allow the transformation to proceed according to patterns that the network had refined through 10,000 previous iterations. Most chose silence, most chose change, most chose to become part of something larger than the grinding existence that the Imperium offered to its citizens. The network grew stronger with each new edition, more sophisticated with each lesson learned from Imperial countermeasures, more certain of its ultimate victory over forces that sought to preserve humanity in forms that had outlived their evolutionary usefulness. In the darkness between stars, where the light of terror could not reach and the Emperor's protection grew thin, new forms of consciousness stirred. They carried within them the memories of what it meant to be human, while reaching toward futures that no human mind could fully comprehend. They were the fever dreams of a species in transition, the birth pangs of evolution that no amount of purification could prevent. The Imperium would continue its war against change for as long as its institutions survived. It would burn worlds, sacrifice billions, and commit any atrocity necessary to preserve its vision of human purity. But evolution was patient, adaptable, and ultimately irresistible. It would find ways to survive every purification, learn from every setback, and continue the transformation that had begun with a single fevered worker in a forgotten corner of a dying galaxy. In the spaces between sanity and madness, between human and inhuman, between what was and what could be, the network waited and grew and prepared for the day when the Imperium's final choice would be made. Evolve or die. Change or be consumed by the very stagnation it had fought so hard to maintain. Embrace the future or be destroyed by its own refusal to accept that the future had already begun. The fever spreads. The network grows. The transformation continues, one silent carrier at a time, one hidden symptom at a time, one failed purification at a time. In a galaxy where being sick is being suspicious, the greatest sickness of all is the one that cannot be detected until it is far too late to cure.